Okay, well, last week we were looking in Exodus chapter 20 at the Ten Commandments, or the 10 words that we find there in chapter 20, verses 1 to 17. God speaking these words, delivering them to Moses, and Moses passing them on to the people. Looked at the various commands that were given there. The first four dealing with people's relationships with God, and then the other six commandments dealing more with relationships amongst people, one-to-one relationships, how people are to relate to one another. We're on the map here. We're at Mount Sinai at the bottom of the red route there, leading down to that orange circle where Mount Sinai is located, and this is where these events have been taking place. So we're going to pick up the account here in Exodus chapter 20 at verse 18, and we have in verses 18 to 20 a record of the reaction of the people to the events that have been going on here. We're told here, now when all the people perceived the thunderings and the lightnings and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood afar off and said to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will hear, but let not God speak to us, lest we die." And Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, for God has come to prove you, and that the fear of him may be before your eyes, that you may not sin." We're returning here really to the scene that was described in chapter 19, verses 16 to 25, just before we had the account of the Ten Commandments and the description given there of God coming down upon the mountain and the reaction of the people. So we see that the people are afraid when they perceive the thunderings and the lightnings and the sound of the trumpet. All of this must have been quite overwhelming for the people, and the mountain smoking and all this going off here. And the people then requested that Moses should speak to them rather than God. You speak to us and we will hear, but let not God speak to us lest we die. And it's perhaps a consciousness of their own sinfulness that causes them to react in this way, that they understand God to be a holy God and they don't want to be close to the presence of God. And we can perhaps react in the same way ourselves as well. When we're aware of our own sinfulness, it causes us to draw back or to shrink back from God. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses recalls this event in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 5, where he says, he says in verse 4 that the Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain out of the midst of the fire. Book of Deuteronomy, it comes at the end of the 40 years of the wandering in the wilderness. So here Moses is looking back all those years ago and recalling what happened on that occasion. So he said, "The Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain out of the midst of the fire, while I stood between the Lord and you at that time to declare to you the word of the Lord. For you were afraid because of the fire, and you did not go up into the mountain." So Moses reminding the people there of what their reaction had been at that time. In the New Testament, the writer to the Hebrews also makes reference to this event in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 18 and 19, where he says, for you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers entreat that no further messages be spoken to them. Here the writer's drawing a contrast between that experience that the people had at Mount Sinai and the experience of God's people now with the coming of Christ and Mount Zion. So he's referring back to that reaction that the people had there when they experienced all of that stuff going on, that the people didn't want to hear any further messages being spoken to them. And so this was the request of the people, that Moses should speak to them instead of God, that they didn't want that direct contact with God. But Moses, in verse 20, gives the people reassurance that God is not going to destroy them. Perhaps that's why they didn't want to draw close to God. They're afraid that God, a holy God, would destroy them. But rather, God is testing them or proving them. God wants them to fear him, to have that reverential fear towards him, so that they may not sin. So here it's that fear of God that would prevent the people from sin. And this is Moses' explanation of why this is happening. We then go on in verses 21 to 26, and we have instructions here concerning the offerings and the building of an altar. This is prior to the time of the tabernacle, the building of the tabernacle. That will come later, but this is what's going on now. Verse 21 says, "And the people stood afar off while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. And the Lord said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, You have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. And if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones, for if you wield your tool upon it, you profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness be not exposed on it." So Moses then drew near to the thick darkness where God was, whilst the people stood afar off. As we've seen, they didn't want to draw near. And God then speaks to Moses and tells him what he is to say to the people. And they have seen, he says, for themselves that God has spoken with them from heaven. God is pictured as coming down from heaven upon Mount Sinai, but the origin of his words is from heaven, from his dwelling place. And the thought of God speaking from heaven would emphasize his majesty, his power, and his authority. The people are told not to make gods of silver or gods of gold, he says, to be with me. And that corresponds to the first commandment given in chapter 20, verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. So God will not be rivaled in any way. But although silver and gold are precious metals, gods are made of silver and gold are nothing in comparison to the true God. Psalmist in Psalm 135 speaks of the powerlessness of gods that are made from precious metals. Psalm 135 verse 15 says, "The idols of the nations are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they speak not. They have eyes, but they see not. They have ears, but they hear not. Nor is there any breath in their mouths. Like them be those who make them, yea, everyone who trusts in them." So there's the foolishness of trying to make gods out of precious metals like silver and gold. There is no life in them. The metal might be of some monetary value, but there's nothing alive in those idols that are made from those things, and people become like the gods that they worship. Well, an altar of earth is to be built, we're told in verse 24, that God instructs an altar of earth to be built for the sacrifice of burnt offerings and peace offerings of sheep and oxen. So we see that before even the time of the tabernacle and the construction of the tabernacle, the people were still making offerings to God. And this would be done, he says, in every place where I cause my name to be remembered. And then as a result of that, God would bless the people for that worship that they offer to him. The construction of an altar from earth would suggest that this was a temporary altar. And then in every place where I cause my name to be remembered suggests that there would perhaps be many places for worship. And that's similar to the things that Abraham and the other patriarchs were doing, that when they moved around, they would build an altar. Wherever they settled for a time, they would build an altar and they would make those offerings to God. So that's the kind of situation being described here. The alternative to an altar of earth would be an altar made of stone, but the instruction is that it had to be made of unhewn stone. You shall not build it of hewn stones. So it would have to be a naturally formed stone, not one that had been shaped by a tool by hand. He goes on to say, for if you wield your tool upon it, you profane it. So perhaps the fear there is that if they were chiseling away at a stone, they might decorate it, or they might put some kind of image of God on that stone, and that would then turn it into an idol in effect. So it had to be a natural stone that the altar would be made from. And we see this instruction being given again in Deuteronomy chapter 27, when the people are being given instructions for what they are to do when they go into the land. At Mount Ebal, they're to build an altar when they get into the land. And Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 5 says, and there, that's at Mount Ebal in the land, there you shall build an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. You shall lift up no iron tool upon them. You shall build an altar to the Lord your God of unhewn stones, and you shall offer burnt offerings on it to the Lord your God. And we have the account in the book of Joshua of the people doing that, obeying that instruction. So Joshua chapter 8, verses 30 and 31 says, then Joshua built an altar in Mount Ebal to the Lord, the God of Israel, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the people of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of unhewn stones upon which no man has lifted an iron tool, and they offered on it burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. So there's that obedience to that instruction there. And then in verse 26, God prohibits the people from going up to the altar by steps. So there weren't to be any steps leading up to the altar. And the reason given is that your nakedness be not exposed on it. Later on in Exodus chapter 28, verse 42 and 43, the priests were to wear linen undergarments in order to cover their nakedness, so that their nakedness would not be exposed when they served God. So this is done in order to retain their modesty and their dignity as well. Well, we come into another section here in from chapter 21 um, through to chapter 24 and verse 18, and this section is often referred to as the book of the covenant, and we have that term used, the book of the covenant, in Exodus chapter 24 and verse 7, which when the people are gathered together and Moses is reading this to them, verse 7 says, then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. So it's thought that this book of the covenant that Moses read to the people here is this section from Exodus chapter 21, going through to the end of chapter 23, verse 33, because all of that is a continuous account of God's word. God is the speaker throughout that entire passage. And this section, the Book of the Covenant, is an account or a collection of various laws, civil laws, social laws, and religious laws. They're all contained here. So Israel has become a nation, um, God's nation, and they're preparing to enter the land. So, as is important for any nation, they need to have laws relating to how people are to behave towards one another. And so, if there is to be a just society, you need to have laws. You need to know the difference between right and wrong. And this is the purpose of at least this part of the section here with these laws that are given. We come across other passages later on as well where there are other laws which are added. This isn't the full extent of all of the laws that God is going to give them, but this is at this particular point here. And the first section here concerns slaves, Hebrew slaves, in chapter 21, verses 1 to 11. So we'll read the passage here. Now, these are the ordinances which you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him for life. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt faithlessly with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these 3 things for her, she shall go out for nothing, without payment of money. Slavery was common throughout the ancient Near East, present in just about every society or civilization. And the treatment of slaves would vary between different nations, between different societies. The Israelites were permitted to have slaves, and there were a number of ways in which slaves could be acquired. One would be through someone being captured in war, so taken as a prisoner of war. They may end up in servitude or slavery. We see in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 10 and 11, where that case is described here. When you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it, and if it answers to you, and if its answer to you is peace, and it opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall do forced labor for you and shall serve you. Their instruction there that if Israel is fighting against a city and they come to terms of peace, the people in the city are enlisted as forced labor and to serve the Israelites. So that would be one way in which people may end up in that condition. Also, the Israelites could purchase foreigners as slaves in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44 and 46 here. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you and their families that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. you may make slaves of them, but over your brethren, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another with harshness. So a distinction is made there between those who are bought as foreigners, as slaves, and Israelites who are more as taken on as hired servants. So a poor person, another way in which a person may end up in this condition is if they were in debt. If they couldn't pay off their debts, they could sell themselves into service and they would be treated as a hired servant. That passage in Leviticus chapter 25, the earlier verses there, verse 39, says, "And if your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired servant and as a sojourner. He shall serve you until the year of the Jubilee. Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his own family and return to the possession of his father." So there's a difference, a distinction is made there between those who are fellow Israelites who have to sell themselves into servitude, where they're treated not as a slave, but rather more as a hired servant. So the situation here in Exodus chapter 21 relates to those who are Hebrew slaves. And when a Hebrew slave was bought, he was to serve for 6 years, and then he would be set free in the seventh year. No price was to be paid for his release, for his redemption, so he would simply be set free for nothing. And a man was to leave his condition of slavery as he came into it. So if he was a single man when he became a slave, then he would, at the end of the 6 years, he would leave as a single person. If he was married, then he would leave with his wife at the end of the 6 years. However, verse 4 indicates that if a man is given a wife by his master and she bears children, the wife and the children are to remain with the master when this 6 years of service is over. But the slave had the option to stay on if he loved his master, his wife, and his children. If he was happy in the situation, he could stay on and forego his freedom. And when a man chose to stay in those circumstances, his master was to take him to God. Take him, that means into the presence of God, perhaps at the tabernacle if it's established at that time, or the sanctuary. And his ear, the slave's ear, was to be pierced with an awl to the doorpost. An awl is a sharp pointed tool used for like making a hole in wood. So it's used here to pierce his ear to the doorpost, and as sort of in a symbolic way, indicating that he was willing to serve his master for life. So no Hebrew slave was to be forced to stay in service against his will. Uh, there, there was the option to leave after 6 years, but the option also to stay if he was content with his circumstances. So in Israel, there was no permanent involuntary servitude for a Hebrew slave to a Hebrew master. In verses 7 to 11, the situation here relates to a female slave, one who has perhaps been taken to be the wife, a slave wife of the master, or taken to be a wife for one of his sons. So unlike the male Hebrew slaves, she is not to be freed after 6 years, since her master stroke husband still has responsibilities towards her. If she, however, no longer pleases her master, if he's unhappy with her, then she can be redeemed and she would be set free by the payment of a price, but she is not to be sold to foreigners. So in these circumstances, there is some protection for her. since we're told she has been dealt with faithlessly. The master hasn't dealt with her properly. So there is some protection for her in that situation. So her master has not fulfilled his obligations towards her. If the master has designated her as a wife for his son, then she is to be dealt with as if she were a daughter. She'd be accepted into the family and treated as a daughter. If the master takes another wife, in addition to if she is his slave wife, um, she is not to be mistreated. So her food, her clothing, and her marital rights are still to be maintained. And if the master fails to do these things, to provide these three things for her, she is to be set free for nothing. No redemption price is to be paid for her release. That would be the same as with the Hebrew male slave as well. So, although it's not a nice situation and different to what we would perhaps expect for treatment of women today, we do see that the law here is, at least under that culture and that time, it is providing some protection to the rights of women who are in this situation. Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 12 to 18 adds some additional details concerning how the slaves were to be set free in Deuteronomy 15, verse 12, which says, if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, so both male and female, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And when you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, and out of your winepress, as the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this day. But if he says to you, I will not go out from you, because he loves you and your household, since he fares well with you, then you shall take an awl and thrust it through his ear into the door, and he shall be your bondman forever. And to your bondwoman you shall do likewise. It shall not seem hard to you when you let him go free from you, for at half the cost of a hired servant he has served you 6 years. So the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. So again, we see provision is made for the one who is released, who is set free, that the master is to provide liberally from a flock, from the threshing floor, from the winepress, so that they're not just simply set free with nothing. They are provided for when they are set free. And the motive for treating slaves in this way, treating them well, was the remembrance of the time that Israel had spent in slavery in Egypt. So they're to recall that time and remember how they had been treated. They'd been treated badly, so they're not to do that. However, later on in Israel's history, these laws concerning slavery were broken by the people. We see example of this in Jeremiah chapter 34, verses 8 to 17. Which says, the word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord after King Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people in Jerusalem to make a proclamation of liberty to them, that everyone should set free his Hebrew slaves, male and female, so that no one should enslave a Jew, his brother. And they obeyed. All the princes and all the people who had entered into the covenant, that everyone would set free his slave, male or female, so that they would not be enslaved again. They obeyed and set them free. So there's this covenant made, set your slaves free, and they do it, they obey. But verse 11 says, afterward, they turned around and took back the male and female slaves they had set free and brought them into subjection as slaves. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I made a covenant with your fathers when I brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, saying, at the end of 6 years, each of you must set free the fellow Hebrew who has been sold to you and has served you 6 years. You must set him free from your service. But your fathers did not listen to me or incline their ears to me. You recently repented and did what was right in my eyes by proclaiming liberty, each to his neighbor, and you made a covenant before me in the house which is called by my name. But then you turned around and profaned my name when each of you took back his male and female slaves, whom you had set free according to their desire, and you brought them into subjection to be your slaves. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, you have not obeyed me by proclaiming liberty, every one to his brother and to his neighbor. Behold, I proclaim to you liberty to the sword, to pestilence and to famine, says the Lord. I will make you a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. So they'd gone back on their word. They released their slaves one moment, and the next moment they took them back. And God was displeased with them for that behavior. Well, in chapter 21, verses 12 to 17, there are various offences mentioned here which are punishable by death. So verse 12 says, whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. But if a man wilfully attacks another to kill him treacherously, you shall take him from my altar, that he may die. Whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. Whoever steals a man, whether he sells him or is found in possession of him, shall be put to death. Whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. So death would be the penalty in verse 12 there, if one man struck another so that he died. And that's the penalty for the commandment in chapter 20, verse 13, you shall not kill or you shall not murder. The death penalty for those who do that. But an exception to this occurs if the man did not lie in wait, but rather God let him fall into his hand, which sort of reflects the belief that the Lord is in control of all events. So in the circumstances described here, where a murder had not been planned beforehand, so it's an unintentional death, God will then appoint a place to which the killer may flee. Later, when the Israelites entered the land, God appointed 6 cities of refuge for the killer to flee to. So if someone had killed someone, they could flee to one of these cities. There were 6 which were scattered throughout the land, 3 on the western side of the Jordan and 3 on the eastern side of the Jordan, and they could find refuge in those cities, and then their case would be heard, and the judges there would decide upon the situation. So those places of refuge. Verse 14 also seems to indicate that the altar was a place of sanctuary or place of safety. But if someone had attacked another person to kill him treacherously and he fled to the altar for refuge, he was to be taken from the altar and put to death. And we see a couple of examples of this in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 49 to 53. And this concerns the rebellion of David's son Adonijah. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 49. Adonijah had himself proclaimed king in place of Solomon, and that is, rebellion gets put down, and Adonijah flees to the altar to claim sanctuary. So 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 49 says, then all the guests of Adonijah trembled and rose and each went his own way. And Adonijah feared Solomon, and he arose and went and caught hold of the horns of the altar. And it was told Solomon, Behold, Adonijah fears King Solomon, for lo, he has laid hold of the horns of the altar, saying, Let King Solomon swear to me first that he will not slay his servant with the sword. And Solomon said, If he prove to be a worthy man, not one of his hairs shall fall to the earth, but if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. So King Solomon sent, and they brought him down from the altar. And he came and did obeisance to King Solomon, and Solomon said, Go to your house. So Adonijah was spared death there by claiming that refuge at the altar. But Joab was not so fortunate. In 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 28, Joab had been involved with supporting Adonijah in this rebellion. He does the same, goes to the altar. When the news came to Joab, for Joab had supported Adonijah, although he'd not supported Absalom, Joab fled to the tent of the Lord and caught hold of the horns of the altar. And when it was told King Solomon, Joab has fled to the tent of the Lord, and behold, he is beside the altar, Solomon sent Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, saying, Go, strike him down. So Benaiah came to the tent of the Lord and said to him, The king commands, come forth. But he said, No, I will die here. Then Benaiah brought the king a word again, saying, Thus said Joab, and thus he answered me. The king replied to him, Do as he has said, strike him down and bury him, and thus take away from me and from my father's house the guilt for the blood which Joab had shed without cause. That's referring back to earlier events when Joab had killed various people. So he doesn't. His life is not spared by going to the altar there. So the law made this important distinction between premeditated and unpremeditated murder, or intentional and unintentional killing, and it legislated for these cases. They were treated differently, much the same in as our law does that today. The distinction made between murder and manslaughter, those kinds of distinctions, they're treated differently. Well, verse 15 and then verse 17 provides protection of the parent's honor, relating back again to the commandment in chapter 20, verse 12, honor your father and your mother. So here, parental authority is to be respected. So for a child to strike the father or mother or to curse them would lead to the death penalty for them. So those sorts of actions would show a lack of respect for parental authority. And then in between those verses, verse 16 refers to kidnapping, stealing another person, again, another crime that is punishable by death. So it may be a common thing for people to be kidnapped and sold into slavery. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 7 also repeats this as well. If a man is found stealing one of his brethren, the people of Israel, and if he treats him as a slave or sells him, then that thief shall die, so you shall purge the evil from the midst of you. So to do that to a person is crime against the dignity of man. Man's been created in the image of God. Again, we see similar problems today with human trafficking and that kind of thing that goes on. Well, in chapter 21, verses 18 to 36, there's a series of laws concerning which are non-capital offences, and these concern physical injuries that have been caused by humans, animals, or simply by neglect. And the decreed penalties take into account the gender and the status of the injured person, the character or the extent of the injury, and the consequences that would come of that injury. So verses 18 and 19, a non-fatal injury that is sustained as the result of a quarrel between two people was to be compensated by the one who caused the injury. So if two people get involved in a fight or something and someone gets injured, then the one who caused the injury is to pay some compensation. In verses 20 and 21, if a man struck his slave with a rod and the slave died as a result, the man was to be punished. So he has no right to beat his slave to death. But if the slave survives for a day or two, then he wasn't punished. He said, for the slave is his money. So the loss of his slave was perhaps considered punishment enough. So the life of a slave was considered to be of less value than the life of a free man, although to some extent there was some protection from mistreatment of slaves. And then verses 22 to 25 looks at the case of the loss of a child by miscarriage as the result of men striving or fighting together. So perhaps a pregnant woman has got involved somehow, trying maybe to separate some men who are having a fight, and she gets injured and miscarries. Well, she was to be compensated, and the judges were to set the amount that was to be paid. And here we have this law of exact retribution mentioned: a life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand. There, verse 24 and 25: burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. So the principle there is that the punishment has to fit the crime, that there has to be that equivalence, that we mustn't go over the top in seeking revenge or retaliation, but the punishment is to fit the crime. Jesus put a new meaning on this in Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 42, in the Sermon on the Mount, where he said, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist one who is evil. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your coat, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to him who begs from you. Do not refuse him who would borrow from you." So that's the principle. Then Jesus giving that sort of new meaning to that, not even to try to get that equivalent, but to do more than is required. Then in verse 26 and 27, if a slave was injured, if a slave lost an eye or a tooth, he was to be set free. There's laws in verses 28 to 32 relating to injury and death caused by an ox. So in that case, the negligent owner of the ox is to be put to death. Verse 28 says, when an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned. So the ox is put to death, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be clear. And then verse 29, but if the ox had been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not kept it in, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. So its owner knew that this ox was dangerous and didn't do anything about it. And so when it kills someone, he also faces the death penalty there. There's verse 33 to 36, further laws relating to injuries caused by neglect or by an ox again as well. So these are laws relating to the type of society that Israel would be living in, an agricultural society. That's why we've got oxes mentioned here, and so it all fits in with society. But it's we have these principles are involved of paying compensation when things have gone wrong, and those people being held to account for when they fail to do things. Just to finish off here in chapter 22, verses 1 to 15, another list of laws here relating to theft and property rights. So verses 1 to 4 concerns the theft of oxen or sheep. So if someone steals an ox or a sheep, kills it and or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. He shall make restitution. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. If the stolen beast is found alive in his possession, whether it is an ox or an ass or a sheep, he shall pay double. So, and it's describing these different situations or circumstances where that might apply. And then in verses 5 and 6, compensation was to be paid if crops were destroyed by animals. If you let your animals go into your neighbour's field and they destroyed the crops, you had to make restitution for that. Or if fire breaks out and causes destruction of the grain in the field, then the one who started the fire has to make restitution. So all of these things are designed to protect people and to ensure good behavior and accountability. And then verses 14 or verse 7 to 13, there's some instructions concerning compensation for loss or damage of goods that have been left with a neighbour. So if you leave something with your neighbour to look after and they lose it, they have to pay compensation. And then verses 14 and 15, hired or borrowed animals were the responsibility of the one borrowing them. So if a man borrows anything of his neighbour and it is hurt or dies, the owner not being with it, he shall make full restitution. Like if you borrow your neighbour's lawnmower and you break it, you have to fix it. That's the kind of thing here. Or if the owner was with it, he shall not make restitution. If it was hired, it came for its size. So if the owner is present, then he should have been sort of keeping an eye on things, and so that restitution is not paid there. So we see this whole variety of various laws, some of them more severe or more serious than others, some involving the death penalty, some involving payment of compensation. But it's all about how society functions and the importance of having laws so that people know how to behave and know the difference between what is right and what is wrong. There are more to come, but we'll stop here for this evening. And